the theme of this summit is expanded states of consciousness and all the different ways human beings have been accessing those for millennia to realize their potential for healing, for personal spiritual evolution, and even awakening. And of course, we're covering all kinds of modalities, including meditation and transformative breath work and plant medicine, psychedelic shamanism, ecstatic dance, music, chant, all kinds of things. And today we're focused on meditation. And so, even as you began exploring your spiritual journey in India early on and began, meeting with various teachers and exploring meditation, how the notion of expanded states what does that bring up for you? And how do you see the relationship between meditation, expanded states of consciousness, healing, awakening, so forth? Maybe we could just start with your general sense of where we are, what are we talking about, and then we'll go deeper into it.
Well, I mean, just within certainly within the Theravada or Southern School of Buddhism framework, there are lots of different kinds of expanded states of consciousness that are talked about, and there's some distinction between them. There are many states that we can actually access that are quite altered from our normal state of consciousness, and we access them through the power of concentration. Most of us are kind of fairly scattered or distracted, maybe not in every arena of life, but at least in some. We sit down even to think something through, let alone to meditate, and our minds jump to the past and they jump to the future, and we're kind of all over the place. And there's a huge amount of energy and attention that is just thrown away in that. And so what we do in the practice of concentration is we gather this energy, we gather this attention, and we settle, usually around a single object. It could be a mantra or a sound or an image or the feeling of the breath. It could be a lot of different things, but it's that gathering that's most important. And over time, what happens is a kind of coherence of our being. And it's like that particular practice is considered extremely empowering because that's a huge amount of energy. It's like the energy of the universe that could be available to us and is not. And when we bring it together, we experience levels and dimensions of experience we couldn't have even fathomed beforehand. But, and there's a but in this, power, which is what is mostly this is marked by, doesn't necessarily mean love. It doesn't necessarily mean wisdom. And so we know people can have extraordinary states of consciousness without wisdom or without love. It doesn't mean they have to be absent, but they could potentially be. And so Buddhism more talks about other expanded states of consciousness, which are marked by wisdom. It's like there's a certain sense of spaciousness, for example, when we have an emotion or we have a thought or we have a sensation, and we're not immediately adding like a million things like this is going to last forever and this is all I'm capable of, and and so instead of that clutter, there's space. And if we appreciate or dwell in that space, we also enter a kind of different way of being, but it's not based on only concentration. And so it also has elements of wisdom because we get to see that emotion or that thought or that sensation without all those interpretations and all those other things we might be adding to it. And so it's a very different kind of experience. And those states are considered ultimately more freeing for us.
Mm-hmm. So the first set of states that were largely based on concentration practices. In the Theravadan tradition, these are sometimes called the jhana states. Is that correct?
Jhanas, yeah. Jhanas
the jhana states.
Yeah.
And you spoke about through the gathering of concentrating the gathering that we're not so scattered, so there's a lot of energy available, and it begins to cohere in a certain way in our being. And one way to describe that coherence might be flow. And so I'm wondering, there might be some similarity between the jhana states and certain flow states that people are accessing through athletics and high performance and everything, because those states also can be very powerful, and people can have a tremendous amount of data available to them and really high performance capabilities, but they're not necessarily characterized by wisdom or compassion or things like that. So I wonder if there's a similarity there.
Yeah, I had never actually thought of that before, but I think you're quite right. I think it is similar because there is a kind of healing that comes with that coherence
Mm-hmm.
and feeling ourselves not so fragmented and not so all over the place. And so it's not to denigrate those states. It's just we can see that both in our own experience and observing others that uh, it isn't necessarily the most freeing aspect of all because it's a question of how do we actually live. It's like we brought a teacher once over from India to the States. This was before we established the retreat center or before there were other retreat centers that we knew of, but there were communities beginning to form around the country. And so we traveled around the country, visiting these different communities of people, meditating, and we were kind of excited, like, isn't this great? Look at what's happening here. And we said to him, this is teacher, isn't this great? And he said, it is great, but there's just one thing. And we said, what is it? And he said, well, kind of reminds me of people a little bit who are sitting in a rowboat and with great endeavor and effort, they're rowing and rowing and rowing, but they refuse to untie the boat from the dock. And he said, people here seem to want to practice sometimes for these great transcendent alternate states of consciousness, but they don't want to pay much attention to how they speak to their neighbor or
Mm-hmm.
their children or how they treat themselves in a time of adversity or stress. And so it's kind of a broadening of understanding of possibility. Yes, those are great states to go for, and they can make a big difference, I'm sure, in, say, athletic performance or performance of any kind. But let's look at the entirety of our lives as a kind of seamless garment. And so there's an integration of our values and our sense of presence and our perspective, our wisdom, and whatever we're encountering.